Welcome to plant identification through flowers. Today we're going to focus on how flowers can help us to identify plants. We're going to start by talking about flower structures, then we're going to look at some examples of the classic flower structure and why there are so many different flower structures out there, but not to worry. We're then also going to talk about flower shapes, we're going to talk about inflorescence, and we're going to talk about flower colors and commonness. We're also going to talk about different genders and sexes of plants, and we're going to see how this all relates to identifying plants. So to start off, we're going to look at a flower structure. The typical flower diagram you'll find online is a generic structure, and I want to say straight off the bat that a lot of flowers are different to what this diagram. But the important part to understand is the terminology and the language used on these diagrams. These features such as the pistil, stamens, calyx, corolla, sepals, petals, they are all common parts of a flower. And most flowers have at least one of those. So let's go through and look at some of these terms and define them for you. Let's start with petals and sepals. Petals are modified leaves that surround a flower's reproductive system. And sepals are what I would call the outer petals usually. They sometimes look like green leaves, but can often just be a second set or even a similar looking set of petals. The petals as a whole with the reproductive system is called a corolla, whilst the sepals of a flower plus the reproductive systems is what we call the calyx. They typically form a whorl around the petals and help to protect these layers. The next thing I want to look at on the diagram is the male and female parts of the reproductive system. These are critical and lead to some more questions later on and often are a major key in identifying certain species or genuses. For example, Herbaceae are often identified by how many stamens, which would be the male part of the plant, are found on the flower. So definitely something to understand. So let's start with the female parts. The stigma plus a style and the ovary, which we won't talk about the ovary too much because that is something that you need to dissect a plant to really see well. I mean, you can often just cut it in half, but honestly, I very, very rarely look at the ovary as a point of identification, even though it can be a critical point in identification. It's not necessary for us to focus on at the moment. That's something for a later course. So to start off with, let's look at the stigma and the style, which makes the pistil. The style is the tube or the longer system of the female part, whilst the stigma is the final tip on top, where the pollen gets brushed across or put onto, that then leads to a fruit developing in the ovary. On the other hand, the male parts are made up of the filament and the anther, which is as a whole collective called a stamen. A filament is similar to a style and is the tubular part or the transporting part of a male stamen. The anther on top is where the pollen is produced and available, and so when the bee comes flying in to get its sweet nectar, which is often underneath these male parts, the bee will accidentally, or maybe on purpose, we don't really know, rub against these pollen points, which would be the anthers on a stamen, and collect pollens on its body. It then goes to the next flower, and by going to this next flower, it might rub against the stigma, and thus you have pollen transferred from one male part of one flower, and the genetics of that flower passed on to another flower, and the stigma then collects that pollen and shoots it down to the ovary to create a fruit and spread new seeds for those plants, creating a genetic crossover. This is a simplified version of how flowering plants reproduce. The final flower structure part that I think is important to focus on when we're talking about plant identification through flowers is the pedicel. In leaves, we have petioles, and in flowers, we have pedicels. The pedicel is simply the stalk that connects the branch to the flower. This stalk or pedicel can have different features like hairs or glands or a variety of other things that help to identify a plant, as well as they obviously provide some sort of value to that plant. Now that we've covered those terms and definitions, let's look at some examples of flowers and recognize these same parts on flowers. So on the left, you can see a close-up of the front of the flower. Can you tell what is the stamen and what is, maybe let's go with the stigma? Can you tell me where the filament and the anther are? Looking at this image, you can see that the slightly brown bits on the inside of each flower, there looks like there's 5, maybe 6, just very quickly looking at it. These brown bits are the heads of the stamens, which would be the anthers, and they are connected by filaments to the base of these tubular flowers. And if you look closely, you can also see within the middle of the stamens and the middle of the flower, there is one without a brown bit. It's got a slightly yellow tinge, and that would be the stigma, which with the style is the pistil, the female part of the plant. In the right-hand image, you can get an idea of where the petals, sepals, and pedicel are on this plant. This is a good example of how I was saying before that flower structures aren't as simple as one diagram. This flower, for example, has petals that open up at the top and then has a long connected tube down to what would be then brackets and the pedicel. So the opening parts of this flower are its petals, and the sepals have been joined to make a tube. And then where the tube connects to the pedicel, it looks like there's little triangular pieces all over the pedicel. These would be brackets, but the piece underneath is the pedicel. I hope that makes sense. From this side image, you can also tell something else quite interesting about this plant, which is a key identification factor. If you go onto PlantNet and look up Eparchis impressa and go back to Eparchis and use the dichotomous key, it will ask you, well, maybe it was Vic Flora, but one of them will ask you whether the stigma and the pistil sticks out from the flower petals. And this is the key factor for identifying this species against another species. And from this image, you can see that the stigma is actually sticking out from the petals. So I hope that's given you an idea. Let's look at another one. The next one we're looking at is the yellow flower. In the top left photo, can you tell me which ones are the anthers, the stigmas, the pistil? Can you tell me which one is a stamen, which one is a filament, and which one is, what have I missed there? Anther? Have I said anther? Well, because it's all yellow, it can sometimes be quite difficult, especially when you're just using a photo. But from this top left photo, you can see that there are long pieces attached to a skinnier piece. From this top left photo, you can see that there are 9 stamens and 1 pistil. The stamens are the larger knobbed end pieces, and the pistil is actually slanted in the middle and quite narrow and skinny. In this particular image, it doesn't appear to have any pollen or still on the plant, and that might mean that these stamens are infertile or don't actually carry, are fake stamens, which would be stamenoids, and that's a whole nother thing that we'll get into later. But for now, it's important to focus on how many stamens, what the stamens look like, versus the pistils. Now, from the right image, there's something else to say about this plant and to help you identify this plant. Can you pick up what is different about this plant? The first thing that comes to my mind is obviously the flower color is a really bright yellow, but the next thing is the buds. They have like a brown, almost fissured or rotten look to them. I don't know how to describe it, but that for me is a key feature, and that is the protective layer, which would be the sepals in this case, before the flower has emerged. And this could be a key identification point of this species. This plant here is called Phebalium whitei. I assume it was named after someone called White, which is ironic because a lot of phebaliums are actually white, and this is one of the only ones that I know of that is yellow, so how about that? But like I said earlier, flowers are not that simple. And as you can see here, there's a wide range of flower shapes, structures out there. Don't feel overwhelmed. This is something that we can learn about and talk more about in future. The most important thing right now is to understand whether you can see stamens, pistils, and to understand the general structure of a flower. In the case of the acacia, the eucalyptus, and even the cranidium, you can see where there are stamens and you can see where there is a filament. Feel free to write a message in the community and let me know about these photos if you want to do so and test your knowledge there.